Rhineland, March 1945. Dawn sits gray on a rain-soaked pasture turned into wire and canvas. A field shower steams at the edge of a prisoner of war enclosure. Delousing tables hiss. A chalkboard lists stations in block letters. Search, delouse, medical exam, inoculations, records. American medics in rubberized parkas open tin cases and set out ampules, smallpox scarifiers, typhoid, paratyphoid syringes, while clerks unroll ledger sheets that won't stay dry. A column of German prisoners shuffles forward under MP escort, boots sucking at mud. At the medical table, a U.S. captain checks a thermometer, then nods once. The first man bears an arm. Cotton, alcohol. The quick pinch of a needle, a square of gauze, a number written on a record card that will follow him wherever the war sends him next. Another prisoner steps up. Then another. The line becomes a rhythm. Left sleeve, right sleeve, scarify. Record. Its tempo faster than the weather and calmer than the day's rumors. Outside the rope, a group of captured German guards, now disarmed prisoners themselves, watch with tight faces as the work proceeds methodically, patient by patient before anyone touches a mess tin. It looks like preference. It is policy. And it exists because disease moves faster than armies when procedure does not. The scene on that muddy Rhineland pasture did not spring from sentiment. It came from law, logistics, and fear of contagion, a triangle that had been tightening for decades. The legal beam was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Its language was dry and absolute. The detaining power must provide medical care comparable to that of its own troops and conduct medical inspections at least once a month to supervise health and cleanliness and detect contagious disease. It also obliged access to qualified hospitals when needed, at the detaining power's expense. In the clipped clauses of Articles 10-15, prevention and parity were not favors. They were duties. American planners translated those clauses into standing procedure. In World War II, the Office of the Provost Marshal General, OPMG, ran POW administration, while the Army Medical Department, AMED, wrote and executed the medical program. War Department circulars and technical manuals laid out the reception pipeline that commanders memorized by heart. Search, delousing medical exam, immunization at the first practicable moment, records, segregation of suspects and isolation for the ill, the paperwork, immunization registers, inspection summaries, monthly health reports, was as central to compliance as the syringes themselves. It made humane intent auditable. Behind the policy stood epidemiology learned the hard way. Crowded camps multiply risk. Smallpox spreads through contact and droplets. Typhoid and paratyphoid follow water and hands. Louse-borne typhus rides the seams of clothing and hair, and can flash through a population when hygiene collapses. Interwar U.S. doctrine had already embraced mass immunization for soldiers. Bringing captured enemies into dense enclosures without the same shields would be reckless. The Army's preventive medicine historians and public health exhibits from the period repeat the same lesson. Wartime movement. Crowding, undernourishment, and poor sanitation make disease a faster enemy than any column of armor. So the processing line became a medical instrument, delousing first to blunt typhus risk. The Allies had adopted DDT spray guns and dusting as a fast, field-worthy control measure against lice. Photographs and museum captions from Europe in 1944-45 are unambiguous about their routine use at camp gates and reception points. Only after men in clothing were dusted and bathed did the medical tables advance them to needles. The order was not negotiable. You do not vaccinate into an active louse environment if you can help it. You drain the vector before you line arms. Vaccines themselves were familiar tools to AMED by 1942-45. Smallpox protection relied on scarification with stable lymph or freeze-dried vaccine. TAB, typhoid, paratyphoid A and B inoculations, given in series, were already standard for U.S. forces and were extended to POWs as policy where supply allowed. The prevention volumes in the medical department U.S. Army in World War II place immunization alongside water, waste, and food control as part of one defensive system. In other words, the jab was not an event. It was a link in a chain. Where did this happen? Everywhere the stream of prisoners flowed. From North Africa and Italy to France and Germany, the route was consistent. Capture, transit cage, temporary enclosure near the front, theater PW enclosure, movement to base camps or shipment to the United States, each handoff with a medical checkpoint. The official histories of the European theater and Ahmed's own chapters on enemy prisoners describe these nodes in the network, stressing that preventive measures had to be portable: medical kits, vaccine cold chain improvisations, delousing rigs, record cards that survived rain. The more prisoners the front produced in 1944-45, the more the line resembled factory. Throughput built to stop something invisible. The logic for apparent priority, vaccinating POWs immediately and en masse, was straightforward and unsentimental. U.S. combat. Troops were already immunized by standing orders. Guards were covered by the same schedules. The weakest link, epidemiologically, was a new intake of prisoners packed close after marches, often hungry, often lousy, and sometimes carrying disease from shattered units and refugee columns. If an outbreak started inside the wire, it would not respect the wire for long. It would reach guards, medical staff, nearby civilians, and other formations through contact, water, and flies. The quickest way to protect everyone was to seal the reservoir at the point of entry, delouse, vaccinate, record, before the column touched mess lines or work details. That is why the needles came before the coffee and the stew. Records mattered as much as syringes. Geneva demanded monthly inspections. Ahmed demanded numbers. Ledger sheets tracked doses, reactions, and absences from duty. Inspection summaries logged lice counts, sanitation defects, and corrective orders. To the outsider, it could look like preference. To a medical officer, it was due process for biology, the only kind that makes a dent in camp disease. The legal language gave the authority. The ledgers provided the proof. By March 1945, with the Rhineland campaigns pouring thousands through temporary enclosures in cold rain, the system was practiced enough to look inevitable. Chalked stations, steam from delousing tents, a stack of record cards that would follow each man to the next cage and the next camp. The guard's silence at the rope was not confusion. It was a dawning comprehension that this steadiness was not a show for prisoners. It was how the U.S. Army kept a different kind of front from collapsing. The second half of the background turns from framework to ground truth, how Ahmed and the provost marshal synchronized people and paper at the cages, how captured German medical orderlies were used under U.S. supervision, and how the same routine held under shortages, weather, and the surges of spring 1945. Turning law and doctrine into ground truth required two synchronized chains: custody under the provost marshal general and care under the Army Medical Department, Ahmed. The OPMG owned the wire, transport, and guard force. Ahmed owned the exam tables, delousing rigs, and ledgers. In practice, their officers worked shoulder to shoulder at every transit cage and theater enclosure, because a clean diagram on paper could fail in 5 minutes if carts, kits, or cards were missing. The reception drill that soldiers memorized by heart: search, delouse, medical exam, inoculations, records, segregation, was not decoration. It was the only order of operations that made epidemiologic sense at scale. Louse control came first. By 1944-45, delousing with DDT dusters had become routine at camp gates and railheads. Contemporary U.S. Army medical volumes even caption photographs of POW intake lines being dusted as they stepped off trucks. The point was to break typhus transmission before men queued at mess or infirmary. Only then did medics advance prisoners to smallpox scarification and TAB, typhoid paratyphoid, inoculations, recording dose and date on cards robust enough to travel through rain and mud. Med furnished the people and paper that made this portable. Theater preventive medicine officers supervised delousing plants, water points, and mess inspections, and they detailed medical teams to POW cages as captures surged in late 1944 and spring 1945. The same official series that chronicled immunization of U.S. troops placed POW measures in the preventive medicine chapter, alongside water sanitation and waste control, an explicit signal that vaccination was one link in a defensive chain, not a standalone gesture. Manpower was multiplied by using captured German medical personnel under U.S. supervision. When available and screened, German orderlies and doctors were assigned internal camp clinics and litter details, while American officers kept custody of schedules, supplies, and records. The arrangement satisfied Geneva's comparable care promise and relieved strain on U.S. medical detachments, but it lived or died by paper discipline. Every jab and inspection had to be traceable in monthly reports. Supply could not be assumed. Vaccines depended on cold chain habits improvised in field conditions. Delousing stations needed powder and nozzles that actually worked after a week of rain. Theater surgeons pushed standardized kits, scarifiers, ampules, syringes, record cards, so a detachment arriving at a new cage could set up the same line in an hour. The U.S. Army's multi-volume medical history is blunt about the lesson. Preventive systems succeed only when they travel well. And in 1945 they were forced to travel daily. Why did the line sometimes look like preference? POWs processed before anyone else. Because by policy and arithmetic, it reduced risk for everyone. U.S. combat troops and guards were already immunized by standing orders. The most volatile reservoir in any enclosure was a fresh intake of prisoners, often hungry, crowded, and lousy after marches. If contagion ignited inside the wire, it would leap to guards and nearby units by contact, flies, and water. The fastest way to protect American personnel and the surrounding population was to seal the reservoir on arrival, delouse, vaccinate, log, and isolate suspects before mess or work details. Contemporary military medicine texts and later summaries of U.S. immunization practice in WW2 describe the same logic: close populations, quick needles, provable records. The monthly inspection mandate from the 1929 Geneva Convention gave commanders legal authority for this tempo. Ahmed's reports had to demonstrate compliance in numbers, lice counts trending down, vaccination coverage trending up, segregation wards occupied or empty, and those auditable tables protected the chain of command as much as the prisoners. The ICRC's text of Article 15 spells it plainly. Monthly medical inspections are compulsory, aimed at health, cleanliness, and early detection of contagious disease. The Rhineland ledger that seemed like theater to a bystander was actually the treaty rendered in pencil and ink. Conditions varied by theater node. In forward transit cages, lines were fast, facilities rough, and throughput the priority. Dust, jab, move. In large theater enclosures, medical officers could repeat doses on schedule, conduct weight checks, and maintain infirmaries. In continental U.S. base camps where tens of thousands of Axis POWs worked under guard, the same doctrine matured into routine. Periodic reinspection, scheduled boosters, sick call with German medics assisting, and a record trail robust enough to satisfy Red Cross visits and post-war archival audits. The architecture differed. The procedure did not. The site that anchored memory, the captured German guards watching in silence while prisoners were immunized, tells a narrower truth inside that larger frame. It was not about charity. It was about control. Vaccination and delousing were the most reliable way to keep a camp predictable, guard forces safe, and nearby communities unthreatened. The U.S. provost and medical systems met on a strip of mud to do a job that spared lives precisely because it looked unremarkable. A syringe, a dusting wand, a card, a ledger. By early March 1945, this rhythm had hardened into reflex. Capture spikes no longer broke the system. They exposed it in view of anyone standing by the rope. What appeared to be priority treatment for the enemy was, in fact, the U.S. Army's way of keeping probability from turning a crowded wire into an epidemic front. With the framework set, the camera can now tighten on the angles that made this work hold. Law and policy as shields, epidemiology as motive, delousing and water control as co-equal partners to the needle, and the paperwork culture that scaled compassion into procedure. The backbone of what happened at the wire was not improvisation. It was the 1929 Geneva Convention, written into U.S. War Department circulars and field manuals. Those pages did two things that mattered in mud. They required monthly medical inspections focused on health, cleanliness, and early detection of contagious disease. And they made the standard of care for prisoners comparable to that of U.S. troops. In practice, comparable did not mean identical equipment. It meant the same preventive priorities: delousing before chow, clean water before quotas, vaccination at the first practicable moment. Command relationships made it executable. The Provost Marshal General owned custody, transport, and guard force. The Army Medical Department, Ahmed, owned prevention and treatment. A captured column could not pass a gate until both chains were satisfied that the Geneva floor had been met in visible steps. Dusting wands used, scarifiers sterilized, Cards written, isolation cots, ready. Where inspectors or Red Cross delegates appeared, the ledgers spoke the same language the treaty used: dates, counts, and orders issued. To the men inside the rope, it could feel bureaucratic. To commanders, it was shield and compass. Shield because numbers proved compliance. Compass because the treaty's rhythm, inspect, record, correct, prevented drift when fatigue and weather invited shortcuts. The law did not slow the line. It stabilized it. Crowded enclosures are engines for disease. The math is unforgiving. High contact rates, stressed immunity, uncertain hygiene. 3 threats dominated planners' thinking in 1944-45. Smallpox, rare but catastrophic, preventable only by vaccination and strict surveillance of takes. Enteric fevers, typhoid and paratyphoid, moving through water, hands, and mess gear, countered by TAB inoculations and relentless water and waste discipline. Loose-borne typhus, the invisible cavalry that rides seams and hair. When lice are present, a single febrile case in a line becomes a cage problem in days. The sequence in the processing lane, delouse, vaccinate, feed, was built to interrupt all 3 at their cheapest points. DDT dusting and hot showers broke the louse cycle at the door. Scarification and injections raised immunity as soon as sleeves rolled. Then mess lines opened with clean hands, dipped ladles, and chlorinated water. The priority some witnesses read as POWs first was, in epidemiological terms, reservoir control first. U.S. troops and guards were already immunized by standing orders. The only volatile variable was a new intake, hungry, cold, and often lousy after long marches. Protect the intake at the gate and you protect the guards, the kitchen, the clinic, and the villages downwind. Outbreaks prevented never make headlines, but they show up in quiet curves. Lice counts drifting to 0, suspect typhus entries thinning to none, smallpox takes recorded and revaccinated on schedule without a single spread beyond the scar. Vaccination without sanitation is false comfort. The U.S. system therefore treated delousing plants, water points, mess inspections, and latrines as co-equal to needles. At a functioning cage, the first sensory impressions tell the story. The hiss of dusters, the chlorine tang at the water trailer, the steam from field showers, the strict geometry of latrine placement downwind and downhill. Typhus prevention began with vector control. DDT dusted into hair, seams, and cuffs. Clothing baked or rotated through heated cabinets where available. Shaved heads where policy and climate allowed. Enteric control lived in discipline. Hand wash stations with supervised soap use. Mess kits dipped in hot water between servings. Guards trained to keep lines from bunching where one spilled bucket could foul many. Water teams chlorinated and tested at posted intervals. The cage had a posted no raw water rule for new arrivals. Waste details were not punishments. They were the most important work in camp. The medical officer's inspection notes read like an engineer's punch list. Drain off standing water near latrines. Add fly-proof covers. Move refuse pits beyond the wire. Fix the split hose at the water point. Each small correction multiplied the effect of the jab given an hour earlier. When the chain held, vector, water, mess, waste, vaccines did their cleanest work. When one link sagged, the ledger caught it before rumor did. What made a muddy clearing behave like a clinic was not only drugs and dust. It was paper. Ahmed's record card for each prisoner carried identity, exam results, vaccination dates, reactions, and isolation decisions. A second camp-level monthly inspection report captured lice counts, sanitation defects, and corrective orders with who and when accountability. These documents traveled, pinned to rosters, duplicated to theater surgeons, shown to visiting inspectors. They allowed continuity as men moved from transit cage to theater enclosure to base camp. Paper also multiplied hands. Under U.S. supervision, captured German medical personnel, orderlies and doctors, could run internal sick call and litter details, but only if their work flowed into American records signed by an American officer. Supply road paper too. Requisitions for vaccine lots, dusting powder, sterilization kits, and ledgers themselves. When capture spikes hit, Rhineland crossings, Ruhr encirclement, the only way to maintain standard at tempo was to treat the line like a procedure with receipts. Station boards chalked and rechalked. Doses tallied by hour. No-shows logged and traced. Suspects tagged to isolation and re-entered later for jabs. The bureaucracy looked dull because it was designed to be dull. In camp medicine, dull is strength. It meant that if a medical officer rotated, the next one could open the ledger, read the last line, and continue the sentence without guessing. These 4 angles explain why the scene at the rope looked the way it did. Legal duty turned into steps, epidemiology into order of operations, sanitation into co-equal work, and records into a bridge between places and days. What remains are the operational and human perspectives, how the system kept up with transport and surges, and how routine medical acts reshaped morale and control inside the wire. The prisoner stream did not pause to be treated. Treatment had to ride the stream. Capture points threw men into transit cages within hours. Trucks and rail took them to theater enclosures. Some crossed oceans to base camps in the United States. Preventive medicine learned to be modular. A medical detachment could step off a 212-ton truck, and in an hour, chalk a 6-station lane identical to last week's. Dust, wash, exam, inoculate, record, segregate. Kits were standardized, scarifiers and syringes in roll pouches, vaccine in insulated tins, DDT dusters boxed with spare nozzles, ledger pads wrapped in oilcloth. Water points traveled too. Collapsible tanks, chlorinators with posted test intervals, and a corporal who knew the taste of too little chlorine. The chain's success depended on repeatability. A man vaccinated in a hedgerow cage needed that entry to count at a railhead 2 days later, and at a permanent enclosure next week. The only way to keep continuity across movement was to make the paper move with the man and to build the same procedure wherever the convoy stopped. When surges came, bridgeheads, encirclements, mass surrenders, the doctrine did not change cadence. It scaled. More dusters, extra tables, longer hours, the same order of operations. The geometry of prevention remained a lane on damp ground, duplicated until the line emptied and the ledgers balanced. Inside wire medicine became schedule. The morning bulletin posted sick call. The monthly inspection drove cleanup and repairs. Vaccination days brought work exemptions and observation rosters to catch reactions. German prisoner NCOs retained for internal discipline learned the rhythm because it made the camp legible. Dusting on arrival, jabs logged, light duty for the sore-armed, weight checks on Thursdays, lice counts every inspection day. For Americans, routine reduced friction. Guards spent fewer hours refereeing rumors when chalkboards explained tomorrow. Mess lines ran calmer when men knew inoculations came before chow, and that the ledger meant a fair turn, not a whim. The medical tent reset expectations, too. Many prisoners arrived primed to hate and to hoard, finding a predictable clinic. Gauze counted, needles boiled, reactions logged, shifted arguments away from personalities and toward the posted schedule. That change paid the camp back as compliance. Lines formed straighter. Work details reported on time. A calm sick call yields a calm afternoon at the wire. None of this softened custody. It stabilized it. The most humane outcome was not kindness. It was predictability. A camp that smelled of soap and chlorine where the loudest sounds were steam, a stamp on a card, and a sergeant reading out tomorrow's hours. The same order that reassured a camp could look jarring outside it. On some days, a visitor's first impression was a hard one. American medics vaccinating enemy prisoners by the hundred while civilians nearby queued for ration cards. The answer lived in policy and arithmetic. Geneva did not permit triage by emotion. It required monthly medical inspections and care, comparable to that given U.S. troops. U.S. doctrine added the epidemiology. A fresh, crowded intake is the highest risk reservoir. Seal it first and you protect everyone. Commanders wrote the explanation into reports rather than speeches. Lice counts trending down. Suspect typhus zeros. No smallpox beyond primary takes. No guard detachments lost to preventable disease. Where the International Committee of the Red Cross or U.S. inspectors walked the line, the ledgers answered the question without drama. Secrecy beyond that transparency was practical. No photography inside the medical lane without permission. No names in public bulletins. No detailed discussion of vaccine stocks or isolation counts that could be twisted for propaganda. The aim was consistent, not performative. Run the treaty like a machine until it vanished into routine. When the system worked, the only story left to tell was a quiet one. A camp that did not erupt. A town that did not sicken. A guard platoon that finished the month without a single fever case traced to the wire. These operational and human angles complete the frame around that gray morning in March. A lane built from treaty articles, carried by trucks, run by habit, defended by numbers. The decisive test comes when volume, weather, and exhaustion converge, when the line must hold through a surge of captives and a scare of fever without bending its order of operations. Rhineland, March 1945, surge day at a forward transit cage 0640 hours. Rain threads sideways across a low ridge. Trucks grind up a chalk road and spill men into a field that has been measured into lanes with pickets and wire. The board at the gate reads like an equation solved many times. Search, Delouse, medical exam, inoculations, records, isolation, if ordered. The provost officer posts his counts. The medical officer checks his kit. Vaccine tins nested in insulated boxes. Scarifiers and syringes boiled and laid on enamel. DDT dusters charged. Record cards stacked under oilcloth. The first column halts at the rope, 7-5. The line moves. Prisoners pass through search details to the delousing tent. Dust wands hiss at collars, cuffs, and hairlines. One man coughs. Another blinks through powder. A German orderly screened and badged hands towels to the newly powdered under an American sergeant's nod. Outside, the water point hums. A corporal posts today's chlorine check with a grease pencil. It is not a speech. It is a signal that the system is awake. 7-3-5. At the medical table, the ritual is scored. The American captain inspects mouths and nodes, listens to chests through damp uniforms, and writes the same letters again and again. SPX scar. For smallpox scarification, W1 for the first typhoid paratyphoid shot, later a triangle for a reaction observed. Needles push, gauze presses, the card drinks ink and rain. Each man's dose becomes a line that will follow him to the next cage. The pace is brisk but not theatrical. One patient every 40 seconds when the lane is clear. Slower when a suspect must be tagged. Wait sound. A runner from the gate, more trucks in the valley. The officer glances at the ledger and shifts a German orderly from litter detail to the scarification station, doubling output without touching the order of operations. The provost captain adds 1 MP to the rope and lengthens the snake of prisoners by 10 yards so the delousing tent does not jam. This is the choreography the manuals intend. Tempo changes that do not break sequence. Route 5. The first test arrives. A prisoner staggers at the exam table, feverish rash not quite right for anything, lice count high despite dusting. The medical officer holds a beat, then taps the card for isolation. 2 orderlies ease the man to a side tent where cots wait under blankets and lamps. An assistant notes temperature and pulse and posts a short watch. Check-in 15, then hourly, until the pattern resolves into something named or the fever breaks. The line does not stop, it cannot. The sanity of a camp is measured in its ability to put a single case aside without turning the rest into spectators. Preventive. A lull and then a surge, the way traffic comes off a bridge. 3 truckloads dismount at once. Prisoners spill, crowd, then settle under the sergeant's hand signals. The delousing plant builds a queue. The medical officer resists the easy mistake, starting jabs on undusted men to keep his table busy. He holds his lane and lets the plant bite down the vector first. At the dusting tent, nozzles sputter. A mechanic swaps a gasket from the spares box without asking for permission. The hiss returns. The chain holds .0940. A Red Cross delegate arrives under an umbrella, escorted by the provost officer. It is not a surprise inspection. It is a calendar one. The delegate watches 3 cycles end to end and then asks for the ledger. The medical officer points to the columns that matter. Number dusted, smallpox scarifications, TAB doses, reactions, men sent to observation or isolation. The delegate nods at the isolation tent, glances at the water point where chlorine tests are posted, and makes a note about latrine drainage to the leeward ditch. He leaves satisfied not because the camp looks handsome, but because numbers exist where rumor could have lived. 10. The prisoner NCOs, former guards among them, stand at the rope, faces tight with calculation. They are learning the rhythm the way any staff learns a factory. One station cannot starve another, and paper must cross each desk once, clean. The shock is not that American medics treat enemy prisoners. It is the steadiness with which they do it. Before mess, before work, before any other business. In their old world, medicine moved with favor. Here it moves with schedule. 45. The isolation tent fills to 3 cots. 2 are likely influenza. 1 is a question mark. The medical officer orders a second dusting pass for the squad those men came with, posts a hand wash bucket at the tent flap, and assigns a German orderly with strict instructions and American oversight. The card trail thickens, names, temperatures, times. A clerk marks a reminder to revaccinate one man whose smallpox scar looks doubtful. None of these decisions are dramatic. They are the grain of prevention. 20. The line whispers rumors. Prisoners have heard that Americans vaccinate before their own. The talk curls into the guards' ears. The truth is simpler. U.S. soldiers and guards are already immunized. The only uncontrolled variable is the fresh intake. Seal the reservoir at the wire and you protect everyone. The kitchen detachment, the clinic, the MP platoon, the nearby village. The policy is not mercy. It is math enforced with syringes and powder and the refusal to be hurried into shortcuts. 25. Rain slackens. The lane shortens as the last truck empties. The medical team walks the rope, catching the stragglers who slipped past a station in confusion. One missed scarification. 2 cards with smeared ink. A man who tried to hide a cough and now sits in observation with tea and a recorded temperature. The detail at the water point retraces their steps with a chlorine test kit and posts the new ppm on the board. The cage smells like soap and canvas instead of ferment. 15. The day's arithmetic begins to show its effect. The isolation tent reports 1 fever breaking, another stable without rash evolution, and the 3rd transferred to a field hospital for diagnosis. The lice count at exit falls compared with entry not by boast but by cards. Fewer nits found, fewer itches scratched under wool. The sergeant orders the delousing tent rinsed and dusters reloaded. The medical officer restocks vaccine tins and logs ampules consumed. The rope relaxes by inches. The camp prepares for the second wave that everyone expects from the afternoon roads. 400. A courier brings orders for movement. A portion of today's intake will march to a larger theater enclosure tomorrow. The only way the transfer will not break the chain is if the chain is portable. The clerk binds today's ledger sheets, checks that each man's small card sits in the right stack and wraps both against rain. The medical officer radios the receiving enclosure with the numbers that matter: total dusted, % vaccinated, isolation head count, and time of last chlorine test. Doctrine turns into continuity when someone on the far end hears these facts and sets out the same tables under a different sky. By afternoon, the camp holds steady under volume, weather, and inspection. A day that could have skidded into spectacle has passed through the needle's eye as procedure. The decisive measure will come when the counts are tallied at dusk. How many men dusted and jabbed? How many sent to isolation? How many mess lines opened without incident? And then again in the morning, when no new fevers ring the bell. The next phase tightens the lens on that arithmetic. Throughput under pressure, isolation outcomes, and the small victories measured in curves that do not lift, the subject of the second half of the turning point. Throughput, outcomes, and the day the curve refused to climb 10 hours. The afternoon convoy arrives in 2 pulses. Wagon covers and truck tarps lift like wet pages. Men file to the rope and the chalkboard's arrows reclaim their authority. Search, delouse, medical exam, inoculations, records, isolation, if ordered. The morning's ledger lies clipped open. A second pad waits beneath oilcloth. The medical officer counts tins. Enough smallpox vaccine to finish the day with a margin for revaccinations. TAB ampoules squared to the hour by a corporal, who writes down not only doses but time, because immunity starts as a future and must be traceable to 1:15:35. A brief bottleneck forms at delousing. 1 duster falls off pressure. The mechanic swaps a nozzle and reed valve in 90 seconds, but the queue is lengthened. The provost lieutenant lengthens the approach lane with pickets and sends 1 MP to keep 30 inches between men. Enough room for dusters to work shoulder seams and collars, not just a token sprinkle. The temptation to thread undusted men to inoculations dies in the officer's throat. The line's order remains intact. On the board, a clerk writes, Plant B 1535-1537, serviced. So the afternoon inspection will show a reason for a momentary dip in output and not a rumor of failure. 100. The isolation tent reports the morning ? Transferred to a field hospital under precautions. The 2 febrile men remaining are logged as influenza suspects. A German orderly, screened, banded, and supervised, sits on a stool with a thermometer case and a watch, recording at quarter-hour intervals. The medical officer glances in, checks respiratory rates, and returns to the lane. Isolation's purpose is twofold: protect the cage from the patient and protect the patient from the cage. The tense quiet is a controlled one. Blankets, tea, a bucket at the flap, and the clean decisiveness that keeps suspicion from becoming panic. 1630. Throughput steadies. 3 medical tables run in parallel, 1 on scarification, 2 on TAB injections. The experience of repetition shows in the hands. Scarifier angle consistent. Cotton swabs pressed, not dabbed. Syringes bled of air with a flick and a glance. Gauge disposed of in a can that rings faintly when steel meets steel. The clerk's pencil never stops. Every 7th man he underlines. A visual cadence that later makes auditing totals by tens automatic. The line looks like a factory because factories are how you win time against contagion. 7:05. A Red Cross delegate returns with a U.S. medical inspector from a nearby enclosure. There are no speeches. They watch how the rope breathes, how the dusters hiss, how the water point posts its chlorine ppm this hour versus last. The inspector asked for reactions. Any fainting, any pronounced fevers after inoculation? The medical officer shows the small section of the ledger where such notes live. 1 queasy stomach resolved with rest. 2 dizzy spells from exhaustion rather than vaccine. No anaphylaxis. No scarification infections to date. The column of zeros matters more than a tour of tents. It means the device, the lane, works without leaving sick men in its wake. TD5. Food waits on the other side of records. The mess sergeant stands behind steam and strictness. No mess kit without a card. No card without the inked entries that show delousing and inoculation complete. At first, hungry men bristle. Then they understand. The rule is not against them. It is for everyone who eats from the same ladle. Soap dip portion. The line flows. An MP uses his palm and not his voice to correct crowding near the boiler. The smell of stew, clean and simple, erases the day's last rumor. That Americans would vaccinate and then forget to feed. Procedure is not a substitute for humanity. It is humanity that can be repeated. 35. Light goes thin. The medical officer drafts a daily report for the theater surgeon. Vaccine lots consumed and remaining. Dusting powder on hand. Ledger sheets indexed by block and bound with twine. An advisory that the next day's convoy will include a transfer to a larger enclosure, and that records will travel with the column under cover. He radios the receiving medical officer with 3 essentials: percent vaccinated, isolation head count, and the hour of last chlorine test. Doctrine turns into continuity at the moment 2 strangers agree on numbers. 900. A small morale moment registers with outsized consequence. The German prisoner NCO cadre, men who had been guards elsewhere, stand again at the rope. Now taking delivery of a stack of printed schedules for the next day. Sick call hours, isolation visits, work exemptions for post-inoculation soreness, latrine maintenance times, slice inspections by block, mess rotations. They expected orders. They did not expect predictability. That shift, fear to schedule, reduces friction in places an MP rifle butt cannot reach. Cues, rumors, disputes over turns. The steepest contagion curve in a camp is social. The ledger flattens it. 30. The medical officer walks the latrines and the drainage line, checks fly screens, notes flypaper strips, and asks for 1 more shovel to mend a ditch bank eaten by the day's rain. He signs a 1-sentence order to relocate refuse pits 20 yards leeward and posts it. Vaccination is the headline visitors notice. Sanitation is the text that keeps the headline from needing an update. 2000. Last check of the isolation tent. 1 fever down, 1 unchanged, cots straight, water bucket dumped and refilled, tally posted. The orderlies, German and American, exchange a nod that is not friendship but practice. Across the wire the camp quiets to small sounds. Boots, canvas, a pot scrubbed clean. The ledger dries by a field stove, its pencil strokes already dull with handling. Dawn next day. The cage wakes to the only graphs that matter. No new fevers at Reveille. Lice counts lower at spot check than the day before. 2 inoculation reactions resolved without complication. Breakfast lines orderly under posted rotation. The convoy rolls with records bound and waterproofed. At the receiving enclosure, the same lane stands waiting. Pickets, dusters, tables, cards. The continuity across mud and miles is the victory, not a scene or a speech. The turning point was not a dramatic diagnosis or a miracle drug. It was the hour-by-hour refusal to let volume, weather, or rumor bend the order of operations. Vaccines were tools. Delousing was a tool. Ledgers were tools. Together, They turned a problem known to devour armies, closed population disease, into paperwork and steam, and a line that ended with soup instead of spectacle. From here, the story broadens to the ledgers and months that followed. How this discipline scaled to larger enclosures and base camps, how Geneva compliance became routine, and how quiet numbers, incidence curves, inspection findings, Red Cross notes, wrote the aftermath more convincingly than any photograph could. The proof of a doctrine isn't a single day that goes well. It's a month that refuses to come apart. By April 1945, the Rhineland cages that had learned to breathe under surges began to look alike in their quiet details. The monthly medical inspection, once a clause in a treaty, read like a calendar that governed everything else. The inspection day forced a rhythm. The week prior, latrine ditches straightened, fly-proof lids repaired, refuse pits moved, water points chlorinated and logged at stricter intervals, delousing plants serviced, isolation tents restocked, ledgers indexed by block. On the morning itself, the medical officer walked with the provost counterpart and a clerk who could recite the last 3 entries of every defect and correction line without looking down. When a Red Cross delegate arrived, nothing needed staging. The camp's story was already written in pencil and mud. Vaccination moved from event to maintenance. The first wave of smallpox scarifications and TAB injections had sealed the reservoir. The following weeks were about coverage, catch-ups for transfers, revaccinations for doubtful takes, second doses for those who had marched through on fever days and returned to the lane healthy. The cards made the arithmetic straight. Names, dates, reactions, strikes through duplications, triangles for follow-up. The clerks learned to see the camp not as faces in ranks but as percentages that must reach lines posted on a board. 95% smallpox scarred and recorded. 90% TAB initialed with returns scheduled for series completion. Those weren't slogans. They were thresholds that let a crowded wire sleep without fever. Sanitation became a trade rather than a chore. Work details were chosen for steadiness, not punishment, and trained by a corporal who understood the difference between clean enough to appease an inspector and clean enough to deny disease. Buckets lived beside taps. Soap was counted like ammunition. Mess discipline hardened until it looked easy. Kits dipped, ladles guarded, no raw water inside the line. The camp smelled like a ship on good days, chlorine and starch, canvas and steel. When it drifted toward smoke and stew without soap, the ledger caught the slide before the stomach did. The hospital inside the wire, clinic is more accurate, settled into patterns that made sense to both sides. German orderlies, screened and supervised, ran litter details and sick call under American signatures. They posted observation lists for inoculation reactions, assigned light duty for sore arms and fevers, and shepherded men back through the lane when series required a second visit to the needle. The arrangement saved U.S. medics from burning out and gave prisoners a predictable route for care that didn't depend on personalities. When disagreements rose, over a work exemption, a clinic time, a missing card, the answer was in the posted schedule and the ledger, not in the volume of anyone's voice. Transfers stopped breaking the chain. A column marched out at dawn with cards bound and duplicates in the pouch. A truck rolled in before lunch. The same procedure stood waiting at the receiving enclosure. The radio exchange that used to be a courtesy became an operational standard. Delouse to 100%. Smallpox scarifications 93%. 23 for revaccination flagged. TAB first dose 89%. 31 deferred for fever, tagged for re-entry. Isolation head count 2. Last chlorine check 0700 within range. These sentences were not romance. They were the way 2 places agreed on the same risk. The best measure of success was absence. Weeks with no suspect typhus beyond the isolation tent. Smallpox takes observed and recorded without spread. Occasional influenza clusters that curved and flattened before rumors could assign blame. Guards whose sick book did not fill with fevers that started at the wire. Towns nearby that heard the camp long before they felt it, because the only thing that crossed the fence with regularity was a truck and not an illness. The administrative echo followed. Theater surgeons folded POW numbers into the same preventive medicine summaries that tracked troop immunizations, water points, and malaria discipline. The provost reports began to sound like medical documents when they described sanitation defects corrected and inspection notes satisfied. The ICRC's visits read dry and satisfied. Numbers present and accounted for, latrines fly-proof, water chlorinated, vaccinations recorded, isolation in use. None of it made rousing copy for the home front, but it meant the apparatus had grown dull on purpose. In camp medicine, dull is a kind of mercy. There were still hard days, movement orders colliding with vaccine shortage, a dusting plant out of commission in a storm, forcing a queue and a risk calculation. A suspected smallpox that demanded a quarantine plan be walked on dirt before dawn. What changed after the doctrine matured was the shape of those days. They became problems that procedure could absorb rather than crises that toppled a fence. The answer to what now was not improvisation. It was a page already present in the binder, and a corporal who knew where the spare nozzle lived. By late spring, the men who had stood at the rope in March, the captured guards, the prisoner NCOs, no longer stared when a camp vaccinated new arrivals before their own. They had learned the American habit of prevention. Seal the reservoir first, and the rest of the day holds. The policy did not make friends. It made predictability, and predictability in a crowded wire is a synonym for safety. The second half of the aftermath widens the lens from one theater to many. How this routine translated to larger enclosures and base camps, how it fed into post-war doctrine, and why Geneva compliance proved to be strategy as much as law. When the river of prisoners widened in April to May 1945, the doctrine that held in muddy forward cages translated almost without edits to theater enclosures, and then to base camps. Scale changed the view but not the verbs. Where a forward cage kept one ledger under oilcloth, a base camp filed binders by block and cross-indexed every vaccination, to work rosters and hospital logs. The monthly medical inspection that once felt like a spotlight became clockwork. Sanitation rounds on Mondays and Thursdays. Chlorine checks at posted hours. Delousing schedules rotated through barracks like a factory maintenance plan. Inoculation series mapped against leave and labor details so no man fell out of the line by accident. The effect inside the wire was a different texture of time. Days no longer lurched from crisis to rumor. They moved in appointments, sick call, revaccination return dates, barracks lice tallies, water point readings, flypaper changes. German prisoner medical personnel, now experienced in the routine they had once watched with suspicion, kept internal clinics that read like small-town surgeries. Dressing changes, cough syrups, thermometer rows in white cases, a slate with initials under observation. American officers signed what mattered. Vaccine lots issued, isolation orders, sanitation defects corrected, and stepped back enough to let predictability do the social work a rifle butt never could. It did not soften custody. It stabilized it. Outside the wire, the doctrine paid dividends no leaflet could claim. Guard companies recorded fewer lost days to fever. Nearby towns, which had their own post-liberation crowding and ration strains, avoided the insult of camp-bred outbreaks. Theater surgeons sent upward reports whose POW paragraphs sounded indistinguishable from the troop preventive sections. Coverage percentages, reaction rates, incidence curves that refused to lift. The International Committee of the Red Cross, touring with notebooks and a habit of understatement, wrote the kind of sentences every commander wants recorded in a neutral hand. Vaccinations documented. Delousing routine, isolation in use, water and waste satisfactorily managed. In a war that produced too many dramatic images, quiet became the most persuasive one here. The system also proved portable in reverse from large to small. When columns moved, base camp paper traveled down echelon as cleanly as up. A work detachment dispatched to a quarry 2 hours away did not become an epidemiologic orphan. Its cards and copies went with it, and the receiving post corporal could read at a glance who needed a return jab on Thursday and who had been flagged for revaccination. The recipe scaled to ships and railheads, to ports and supply depots. It even tolerated the rough edits reality imposed. Vaccine short for a day, dusting plant down for an hour. Latrine moved for drainage, because the order of operations remained sacred. Control the vector, control the water, record the jab, protect the patient and the camp with isolation when doubt touched the ledger. If the practice looked to some like indulgence toward enemies, the arithmetic never did. Geneva compliance was not charity, it was strategy. A closed population is either a fuel source or a firewall. treatment comparable to one's own troops, delivered at the first practicable moment, turned the POW enclosure from a risk amplifier into a risk sink. The same rationales that guided malaria discipline in the tropics or mess hygiene at stateside posts made sense here. At harsher latitudes and under sharper scrutiny, prevention is cheaper than cure, and auditable prevention is stronger than memory. The ledgers protected the chain of command in two directions: downward by telling every corporal what to do at 700, upward by proving to inspectors and publics that what should be done had been done. These habits outlived the camps. Post-war, the Army's preventive medicine manuals read like annotations to what POW enclosures had rehearsed under pressure. Standardized kits, portable records, threshold coverage targets, monthly inspections that are more correction drill than ceremony. Civilian relief efforts and displaced person centers borrowed the same grammar for crowding and movement: dust, wash, inoculate, record, isolate, feed, then repeat until the curve stays flat. The moral lesson traveled quietly with the technical one. If you want a crisis not to become a story, you must let procedure become a habit before anyone asks for a speech. There were limits and blemishes. No system in a war that large escapes them. Supply hiccups sometimes forced an inelegant queue. A storm could drown a ditch and demand a midnight shovel line. A suspected smallpox, however rare, could still pull a cordon that felt like a second fence inside the first. Yet even those moments fed the doctrine rather than cracked it. The next morning's binder held a new one-page fix. Spare nozzles here, ditch bank widened there, an extra isolation cot on ready reserve, a note to rescreen prisoner orderlies after a run of influenza. The architecture of control hardened not by edict, but by the accretion of small corrections. By summer's end, the astonishment that had once frozen at the rope, the look on former German guards' faces as American doctors lined their prisoners for needles before stew, had faded into a more complicated recognition. What felt at first like favoritism revealed itself for what it was: containment with a conscience, and a conscience defined by checklists, not sentiment. The war would end. The habit would not. Somewhere beyond the wire, a manual writer sharpened a pencil and added another paragraph to the preventive medicine chapter. Dull words that, in crowded places, had saved more lives than any headline could count. The camera returns now to the field table where this began. A syringe, a ledger, a posted schedule, and asks the last question a war story can ask without raising its voice. What does it mean, in the middle of ruin, to choose procedure as your instrument of mercy? At a distance, war is made of arrows on maps and dates on screens. Up close, it is steam from a field shower, chlorine at a water point, a scarifier's small click against enamel. The difference between chaos and order is sometimes no larger than a card that does not smear in the rain. In the Rhineland mud, the American choice was not dramatic. It was procedural. Dust the seams, boil the instruments, inoculate at the first practicable moment. Write it down so the next place can begin where this one stops. That rhythm could look like softness to an angry eye. It was, in fact, a kind of discipline sharper than any speech, one that refused to let fever cross a fence because habit got there first. The law stood behind it, Geneva's dry promise of comparable care and monthly inspection. But law alone does not lift a sleeve, people do. A corporal who knows the taste of underchlorinated water, a clerk who draws a triangle for a revaccination and remembers the face it belongs to, a German orderly who, under watch, finds that clean gauze and a posted hour settle more arguments than any voice raised at a gate. None of these acts change the nature of war. They change its texture, from rumor to schedule, from improvisation to drill, from spectacle to a line that ends with soup. The surprise on former guards' faces, the shock that an enemy would vaccinate their prisoners before the stew kettle, dissolves once the arithmetic is explained. Seal the reservoir, and you protect everyone. The mess, the clinic, the guards, the town beyond the hedgerow. Mercy here is not a mood. It is a method. When the ledgers dry by a field stove, they hold more than numbers. They keep a quiet record of where probability bent away from catastrophe. No new fevers at Réveillé. Lice counts lower than yesterday. Reactions noted and resolved. A convoy that arrives to the same lane under a different sky. History will remember the vast arcs and named offensives. Somewhere between those strokes, a cage on wet ground chose routine over noise and kept faith with a treaty by making it ordinary. The last image is simple. A sleeve rolled, a steady hand, a pencil mark that travels. Not a hero's pose, but an insistence, calm, repeatable, and enough. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.